Hi all, this is part 3 of our investigation into contractarianism. Up until this point, we've discussed 3 different inroads to contractarianism. First, Hobbes's considerations about the state of nature. Second, a consideration of prisoners' dilemmas. And finally, Rawls's thought experiment about the original position. We've also talked about contractarianism's fundamental moral principle and talked about the principles of justice that might be produced by a contractarian theory those principles are those that Rawls developed out of his consideration of the original position. Now what we're going to focus on in this lecture are some of the advantages of contractarianism, some of the theoretical virtues, and we'll give particular focus to the way contractarianism gives us a nice way to discuss disobedience, civil and even uncivil disobedience. And finally, we'll talk about some lingering problems, some lingering hurdles that theorists still grapple with today. So we'll start with the advantages of contractarianism. One of the first advantages is it views morality as essentially a social phenomenon. So there are no self-regarding moral obligations. Why do we need morality? It's just morality is nothing more than special rules of cooperation. So if there were but one person in the world, we wouldn't need morality. You would just do with yourself as you would like. But as soon as there's more than one person, now we need to establish rules of cooperation, and those are the rules of morality. So this is nice, as many people think people can spend their own time how they wish, as long as they're not infringing on anybody else's good time. So if you feel like sitting on the couch and eating Doritos and watching a marathon of Breaking Bad, then you are perfectly within your rights to use your time that way, and contractarianism has your back if that's your view. Second and third, I'll sort of blend these together. It explains and justifies the content of moral rules, and it gives us a method for determining if any rule is justified. So how do we justify the content of moral rules, and what's the method we use to determine whether rules are justified? It would be thought experiments like Rawls's state of nature, or thinking about the original position and what sort of society we would want to live in, what would be fair terms of cooperation for society if we didn't know what our role were to be. The next point, the next advantage, is it explains the objectivity of morality. So every moral theory has this issue at its root. Why should we follow the rules? Do moral rules, are we obligated to follow them in any way, or are they just rules that people want us to follow, but we have nothing grounds our obligation? We might especially wonder about this if we were, say, disappointed with religion, if we realized that if we came to the view that there were no God, and if we were worried about the objectivity of morality now, social contract theory has something to say about this. So why should we follow moral rules? Where does their force come from? According to according to Hobbes, it would be that we should consent to the rules of morality because we set them up for the benefit of everybody. If you're thinking about it from Rawls's perspective, then we should follow these moral rules because they're what we would consent to if we were asked to come up with rules for society to follow so that we can best cooperate and have the best lives. So although morality is a construct on this view, these contracts we come up with, that doesn't mean they're strictly subjective. So it's not the case that for any one person they can do whatever they like. Rather, it's about fair terms of cooperation for everybody, but they're fair terms that we would, if we were put in the position, at least this is the contention, that we would support. So morality isn't completely subjective, nor is it something that's not a human creation. It's in fact both a human creation and objective. So that's where its force comes from. Next, and related, it explains why we have a basic moral duty to obey the law. And that again gets us back to talking about the benefits of having a social contract. We're obligated to follow these laws because we make them for ourselves, right? Now, this can get a little bit problematic, very problematic, if we're talking about different groups of people and people who are adequately covered by the contract and people who are not. And that's in fact what we'll get into next. So we have a basic moral duty to obey the law because they're the terms of cooperation we set for ourselves, and they're what we would endorse if we were to think about it from the original position. Finally, it explains why it's sometimes okay to break the rules or disobey the law. So when would it be okay? If the law or the rules did not reflect the rules that free, rational, equal people would put in place for a society, if they didn't know their position, then the rules are unjust. In which case, it would be okay to break those rules. But we're going to put a little bit of a finer point on this, and we're going to talk about civil disobedience. Before I get to the next page, I'm going to read what I felt was a striking example of civil disobedience. This is from Candace Delmas's A Duty to Resist, which is a fantastic book. It just came out in 2018, I believe, and it's all about civil and uncivil disobedience and when it's justified according to Contractarianism. And she opens the book with this description. The section's called Riding for Freedom. The attack started when the riders reached the bus depot in Rock Hill, South Carolina. There were 13 of them, 7 black men and 6 white. They had set out from Washington, D.C. a few days earlier, on May 4th, 1961, on their way to New Orleans. There was no special reason for their visit to Rock Hill. They just stopped to stretch their legs, use the restroom, and get off the road for a few minutes. But at the Greyhound station, 20 white men, some of them members of the KKK, were waiting for the group. The bus riders were not some anonymous 13. They were the Freedom Riders, dispatched by the Congress of Racial Equity to break the laws of the American South. CORE, the Congress of Racial Equity, had organized its first Freedom Ride, known as the Journey of Reconciliation, 14 years earlier after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Irene Morgan v. Commonwealth of Virginia that racial segregation was prohibited in commercial interstate travel. But Southern authorities ignored the court and continued to uphold decades-old Jim Crow ordinances denying blacks equal rights to the highways. That meant integrated buses themselves could be banned from the roads, and bus stations could bar blacks from their waiting rooms. When the Freedom Riders arrived in Rock Hill, they found a mob with enforcement on its mind. It was there that a young KKK member, Elwyn Wilson, famously and savagely beat the now late John Lewis, a black man who, like the other Freedom Riders, was thoroughly trained in and committed to nonviolence. Many years later, Wilson would publicly repudiate his actions and apologize to Lewis, who had become a senior member of the U.S. Congress and a highly respected elder statesman of the civil rights movement. But that was a long way off. In 1961, the air was so thick with anti-black violence that MLK, who had drawn national attention by leading the 55 to 56 Montgomery bus boycott, refused to support the freedom rides. The activists, quote, would not make it to Alabama, he warned. In spite of King's well-earned pessimism, the Freedom Riders and their two buses, one Greyhound and one Trailways, did make it to Alabama. Just outside Anniston, a small city in the northeast of the state, a group of Klansmen pelted the arriving Greyhound with rocks and slashed its tires. After forcing the driver to stop, the Klansmen firebombed the bus. As it burned, they held the doors shut to ensure that no one could get out. For reasons that are not clear, the mob eventually retreated, and the gasping riders escaped, only to be assaulted on the side of the road. In town, another group of Klansmen boarded the Trailways bus and beat the Freedom Riders nearly to the point of unconsciousness. Bloodied but undaunted, the Freedom Riders continued to Birmingham, where a large crowd waited with baseball bats, iron pipes, and bicycle chains. Police Commissioner Bull Connor and his men participated in the assault. Jim Peck, white and a veteran of the Journey of Reconciliation, was beaten so badly that his head wounds alone required 53 stitches. The first hospital Peck was taken to refused to provide him with treatment. He nearly died on his way to another. She continues, but I'll cut to the point of this story. By engaging in peaceful, nonviolent public disobedience, the Freedom Riders helped to persuade the government and at least some portions of the public of the Jim Crow system's brutality and injustice. So with that example in mind, let's talk about civil disobedience and the conditions under which it might be justified according to Contractarianism. So, when might it be? So what if the laws are unjust and set out unfair terms of cooperation, or, as in the case of the interstate travel laws, if they're unequally enforced? Because remember, at the beginning of that story about the Freedom Riders, the letter of the law was that blacks in the South had equal rights and that discrimination was unjustified. But the laws were unequally enforced, and you can see how that came to a head when these Freedom Riders were driving the bus across interstate lines. So the laws, while the laws may have been just, the enforcement was clearly not. Recall that laws are justified only if they mirror the rules that free and equal people would accept, or that people would accept in the original position. If they don't, if the mirrors don't mirror those rules, then the whole point of the rule of law is undermined. The whole point of the rule of law being that all these groups and all these people can benefit from the rule of law. So when Rawls actually goes out of his way to put a finer point on this, he was concerned with justifying the civil disobedience that was happening as part of the civil rights struggle. He was concerned with justifying it because conservatives of his day were quick to call the dissenters thugs and say that it was a breakdown of law and order. If you're listening to this lecture when I'm making it in October of 2020, this talk may sound familiar. It's exactly the sort of talk that surrounds the Black Lives Matter protests. So Rawls was concerned with justifying the acts of civil disobedience that we were seeing then, and so to justify it, he set out these conditions. So civil disobedience is justified when it is intended to urge the elimination of a clearly unjust law or practice. Rawls himself thought that it had to be in order for civil disobedience to be justified, there had to be a violation of the first principle of justice, that we discussed in our last lecture. So that again is the equality of rights. If something, if there was a violation of that principle, then that could live up to, or that could be so serious that civil disobedience was justified. But people may disagree about how wealth should be distributed. He didn't think that that would merit civil disobedience, but a violation of the equal rights principle would. Second, it needs to appeal to the public's sense of justice. So civil disobedience is not an attempt to coerce people to accept a position. It's an attempt to get people to see clear instances of injustice. And, well, let me get to the next point, and I'll tie some of these together. The actions, civil disobedient actions, must be performed openly with a demonstrated willingness to pay the price. This demonstrates a rejection of a specific law or practice, but does not indicate a rejection of the system itself. In fact, insofar as people are willing to pay the price, it reinforces the authority, the validity of the system, while trying to pinpoint a specific instance of injustice. And finally, and this is much debated in the philosophy around this, the actions must be nonviolent. So civil disobedient actions must be nonviolent, which means no rioting, looting, or vandalism. It's exactly this that Delmas, in her book, targets. Again, her book is called A Duty to Resist. I strongly urge that if you have time and interest, you read it. It provides tremendous clarity on the ongoing issues that the United States has with racial justice and gender justice and all sorts of justice of all kinds. On her picture, the scene that she describes in the beginning of the book, she thinks is incredibly virtuous. In fact, if you watch videos of the civil disobedience that was going on as part of the civil rights protests in the 60s, it's incredible the restraint that the disobedience had, the people who were disobedient that they had. They would accept the beatings. And one thing we might worry about here is this setting up a standard that's not a human standard? Is this setting up a standard that is for superhumans, not just humans? I mean, watching people accept beatings that are clearly unjust is an intense experience. It's really hard to watch. And are we wrong to think that people who are suffering the burdens of injustice, that's the bar they need to live up to? Rawls, for his sake, this is essentially his theory. This is what he thought was justified. He was trying to reclaim a sense of law and order for the civil disobedience that was happening. But let me get back. I got a little sidetracked there talking about why uncivil disobedience might be justified. Let's get back to civil disobedience. So one thing to note here is that civil disobedience is something like a speech act, right? It's trying to communicate something. It's trying to communicate a contradiction that exists in a state that's nearly just. So in a state where the public has a sense of justice and they don't recognize that justice is not reflected in their laws, so people routinely break the laws, ritually break the laws, willing to accept the price to demonstrate to the public that there's a clear injustice here. And under those conditions, civil disobedience is justified. Domas argues that uncivil disobedience is justified in those conditions as well. Many types of uncivil disobedience. Disobedience that would include things like targeted looting, pushback in the form of riots, etc. All right, so having covered social contract theory and disobedience, in fact, while it might not seem to be an advantage, I would say that this is actually an advantage of social contract theory, that it gives us the resources to talk about when civil disobedience or uncivil disobedience might be justified and when it's not justified. Because there would certainly be cases where it's not justified. If there wasn't an unjust law or practice that people were uncivilly disobeying, or even civil disobedience was aimed at a just law or practice, that clearly would not be acceptable. If it wasn't an attempt to persuade, then it could arguably not be justified. And if people were not willing to pay the price, then maybe it would be unjustified, although this condition is arguable as well. The final point I want to make about this, or two final points I want to make about this, the first being that in its attempt to persuade a society to modify their social contract, you can see that civil disobedience might be seen as incredibly virtuous. So it's an attempt to fix the contract instead of reject it, right? And if there are tensions in a society, if there's hypocrisy in a society that isn't recognized, then disobedience might be necessary to fix the holes in the existing contract. The final point I'd make here is that social contract theory was very much in the mind of the founding fathers of our country when they were writing the Declaration of Independence. So the rights that they saw as self-evident, and that it was time to not just have civil disobedience, that the time for civil disobedience was over and it was time for revolution. So if the contract is so unfair, then it may be time for revolution. And that's how the ideas that were in mind of the founding fathers of this country. All right, so now let's go on to talk about some of the lingering problems with social contract theory in a more general way, not just focusing on little aspects of it here and there. So the first is this issue of consent. Somebody might point out to social contract theorists or contractarianisms that we never actually consented to these moral rules that are handed down to us, or these laws that were handed down to us. We just happened to be born in a society where people were following these rules, following these laws. Isn't that a big consent if the rules get their force, their authority, their legitimacy from our consent, and we never consented to the rules, then aren't they legitimate? Isn't social contract theory broken from the beginning? One way that people have tried to rescue this is maybe tacit consent is all that's necessary. So, for example, if you have a meeting in a boardroom, and if you ask if there's anybody who objects to the policy before the board, then to state their case now or forever hold their peace, right? You can also imagine a wedding if anybody. The language that used to be in weddings, where if anybody objects to this union, state your case or forever hold your peace. If nobody says anything, then that's enough to say that there's tacit consent. They don't need to say, yes, I agree with this. Them not voicing an objection is enough. But this is problematic because there are some people who loudly decry the laws that they're forced to live under, and they they would never consent to this. So they don't, it's very clear that they don't tacitly consent to the society they live in, because they're maybe even agitating for revolution, right? So we still would want to say that the rules of society would have some force, and the moral rules would have some force, and that these people should follow the rules as long as they're just. So tacit consent doesn't seem to do the work we want it to do. So maybe instead all that's required, and this is a nice elegant solution I think to the problem, is maybe hypothetical consent is all that is required. So it's not that anybody has actually consented to the social contract, nor do people need to tacitly consent. Instead, it's enough that if we were stripped of all our biases and put in the original position, that we would consent under those conditions to the rules that those people would set up for the mutual benefit of people living in society. And this to me seems like a nice solution to the problem of consent, but it's still a hot button issue in contractarianism. Finally, I want to talk about the scope of the moral community. So we talked about the scope of the moral community when we were talking about utilitarianism. We talked about it when we were talking about deontology as well. For utilitarians, anything that can feel pleasure and pain is in the moral community. Anything that can't is out. For Kantian deontologists, it's anything that's rational and autonomous, and anything else is not direct. It's not directly. Doesn't have direct moral status. It might have indirect moral status because people might care about things like non-human animals. So what's the scope of the moral community according to social contract theory? Who's in? So who has moral status? Who do we need to consider when we're considering actions or making judgments? Who's in is rational, self-interested beings. And so far this sort of follows Kantian deontology, but here's a slight departure. Who could be threats if kept out of the social contract, or benefactors if we let them in, and whom we are unable to gain from without their consent. Remember, the foundations of contractarianism is the recognition that people are essentially self-interested, and the morality that's of contractarianism is built on that foundation, the foundation of self-interest. So why are people bound to the social contract? Because it's for their own good that they get into these sorts of arrangements. If letting other people into the social contract would not benefit us, would not benefit the people making these rules, then there are no resources in social contract theory to demand that people be let in, because what justifies the contract, or what the project tries to do, is build from the self-interestedness of human beings to the moral rules that we try to follow. So then who is out? Well, non-human animals, as being beings that we can't negotiate, they're not going to be directly covered by the social contract. Future generations, because they're not around to bargain for themselves. Oppressed populations, because they don't have the power to negotiate. We can take from all of these groups, we can take from them without their consent. So non-human animals, we can, regardless of how powerful the non-human animal is, with our technology we can overpower them, we can take from them anything we want. Similarly, from future generations, we can ruin the world for them, and they have no say in it as of yet because they're not born. And oppressed populations don't have the resources to fight. So now somebody might say, well, that's not so bad. I'm part of the privileged group here, so why is this a problem? And we have to get a little bit abstract to talk, or think about a weird thought experiment to think about why this is a problem. What we're saying is beings outside of the contract, we can act to them as we wish. We might be kind to them, but they're not expressly covered in the contract, so we can do as we will. This is a problem because imagine that imagine this crazy thought experiment, maybe not so crazy, that a powerful alien race came to Earth. And they told us that their power vastly surpassed ours. And while it was nice to meet us and interesting to study us, they were under no obligation to treat us with any respect, and they could use us in whatever ways they felt like. We might think that's morally wrong. The aliens shouldn't treat us like that. The problem is, contractarianism, at least on a first pass, does not give us resources to deal with the aliens. They're right. They would be just like a powerful conquering group that could take whatever they wanted from a less powerful population, and we would have no recourse to moral principles to say why what they're doing is wrong. We would need the resources of another theory, like deontology. We could say, wait, we're rational and autonomous, you can't treat us this way. Or utilitarianism, we could say, wait, we can feel pleasure and pain, and you're going to cause us pain. We don't like that. We need to be factored into your moral calculations. On the view of contractarianism, there would be no reason for the aliens to put us into their contract, because imagine their technology was so advanced that they could take from us whatever they wanted. And then we'd be in a similar position as oppressed populations. Future generations or non-human animals are to powerful groups that have social contracts that cover the members. Now, maybe we'd have to engage in disobedience, civil and uncivil, to demonstrate to the aliens that maybe they held some moral principles that we could appeal to. But contractarianism won't give us the resources to do that. All right, so thanks for sticking through this lecture as well. At a future date, I'm going to have an even bigger discussion about civil disobedience and contractarianism. But if that's up, I hope you enjoy it. If not, then this is the end of my talk on contractarianism. I'll talk to you next time.